Good evening, and welcome to another Zoom event from the Northumberland Learning Connection, also known as NLC. My name is Dorothy Gale, and I'm the chair of the program committee. Before we begin, I respectfully acknowledge that Northumberland County is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Iroquois, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples. This territory has been inhabited and cared for from the beginning by Indigenous people and is covered by the Williams Treaties. If you have been following NLC, you know that this month we are holding a 3-event mini-series on climate change, coincident with COP26, which ended last weekend. Last week, we gained an understanding of financing a net zero in the future, and would ensure both environmental stability and economic prosperity from Sarah Alvarado. It was quite a substantial topic. This week, I have the pleasure of introducing an expert panel on global actions to support pathways to net zero. One of the panelists, Catherine Abreu, and our moderator, Diana Fox-Carney, attended COP26 in Glasgow. Both are joining us now from the UK. Diana is a global climate policy expert, sits on a number of advisory boards, most recently Terra America, a global ag tech leader with the goal to reduce synthetic pesticide use by 80%. She is a frequent webinar moderator for Corporate Nights. Catherine Abreu appeared several times on CBC recently, reporting on COP26. In August, she left her position as executive director of Climate Action Network, a coalition of more than 120 organizations working coast to coast to establish Destination Zero, a not-for-profit focusing on climate action and global energy transition. She is one of 14 members of Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body. Yung Wu is Chief Executive Officer of the Medical and Related Science Innovation Hub in Toronto, named Mars Discovery District. With a budget of $5.6 billion, it employs over 20,400 people in health, clean technology, financial technology, and enterprise sectors, fostering cross-disciplinary collaboration to drive breakthrough discoveries. He is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Entrepreneurial Master's Program, and he's also a member of Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body. Ralph Torre is Director of Research for Corporate Nights, an investment research and publishing firm focused on promoting an economic system, recognizing social, economic, and ecological costs and benefits, also known as clean capitalism. He has been involved in international climate policy since 1988 and has served on boards for nonprofit organizations, was a candidate for the Green Party in 2 federal elections, and lives right here in Cobourg. We are thrilled to have panelists of such high caliber for this 2nd event of our mini-series, and I'd be remiss in not thanking Ralph Torre for his help and advice in putting the panel together. Don't forget to submit your questions using the Q&A function so that Diana can include them in her discussion with the panelists. So without further ado, over to Diana to give her firsthand perspective on COP26.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, and thanks to everyone who's joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. As Dorothy mentioned, I'm joining from London. I was in Glasgow, as Catherine was. Listen, it was a complicated event in Glasgow. People said it's the world's largest negotiation coupled with an extremely large trade fair. So there are lots of things happening in Glasgow, but my takeout is that we are both in the best place we've ever been on climate action, but in the worst place we've ever been on where the climate is. So we have to hold those 2 things at once. I mean, overall, Glasgow was positive. It came in my opinion, and Catherine may disagree, but it came in around the top of our expectations on the actual agreements in the formal part of the proceedings. The UK did a good job against contrary to expectations and COVID worries, etc. They actually did a reasonable job of hosting the event. And I think it showed that the world and that governments are very serious about climate change, and that the direction of travel in terms of both mitigation and adaptation and resilience, which are issues that came up at this COP and we can talk about later, there is an unstoppable movement in that direction. However, we don't have sufficient amount of time to do what we need to do. We need to massively accelerate the pace. During the COP, I mean, many of you will know that we started off, there was talk of 7-8 degrees warming a while back. Before the COP, they were around 2.7 degrees warming they proposed against the 1.1, 1.2 that we've already seen. And during the COP, there was a suggestion that if all the policies were implemented, we might make it to around 1.8. That was on sort of halfway through the COP. Then there was a more, perhaps a greater analytical work done, and there was a suggestion that we make it to 2.3 degrees of warming. So this is not where we want to be. The goal of the COP was to keep 1.5 degrees of warming within reach. It's my view that we just about managed to achieve that by putting in place lots of different types of agreements, lots of different types of pledges, and lots of willingness to compromise, I think, was the most important thing that I took out of the last day. People didn't hold the whole thing up for their own not personal, but their own country's interests were not such that they weren't prepared to compromise, and the less developed countries compromised a lot, and we can talk about the end point of COP later on in the event. But lots of important efforts. Canada contributed, was there at the table on the global methane pledge, the deforestation, the commitment to end deforestation by 2030. Most of these commitments don't have very clear mechanisms in place to enforce them, and that's the really important piece. Canada, as you know, has its own net zero commitment. It came in with an NDC, a climate agreement that was reasonably ambitious. So to reduce 40 to 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. There's been a lot of analysis of whether that's possible. If we do everything that's in the book, it might be possible. We're at that level of certainty. Everything needs to happen, and we still might only just achieve it. So much work to be done. That's my initial take. I'm very happy to come back on it. Kat, I will ask you about it later on in the event. I'm sure you've probably got a slightly different view of it to me, but let's get on now with the main event. We're going to have each speaker is going to do a short presentation. We're then going to have a moderated discussion around some of the issues they talk about, and we're going to bring in your questions. We'll come to those at the end, but please throw them into the Q&A panel as we go along. I will also try and draw those in when I'm doing the moderated discussion. So without further ado, Catherine is in fact our first speaker this evening. So perhaps you could start by just giving your overview or agreement or disagreement with broad general direction of travel, and then tell us what about the issues in hand. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Diana. Yeah, so I think my top headline takeaways from COP is that we really saw a world united in this kind of desperate hope to keep alive the goal of holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoiding some of the most irreversible impacts of climate change. But I think we also saw a world divided on the scale of effort and the kinds of measures and policies that it's going to take to get us there. And I think maybe one of my biggest remaining questions, or some of the homework that falls out of COP26, is, as you rightly pointed out, how we keep track of and hold accountable these various commitments that countries have signed up to over the course of the last couple of weeks in Glasgow, because we don't necessarily have those tracking and accountability mechanisms built into many of those commitments. So we have to figure out how we ensure they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And that's really important, because here we are talking about getting to net zero by 2050. And I think when we hear this concept, it sounds as though we are talking about something, decades in the future, 29 years from now. But that project of getting to as close to zero emissions as we possibly can by 2050 should have started decades ago, and certainly has to start in earnest right now. We have to be reducing our emissions aggressively today, tomorrow, and every day thereafter between now and 2050 if we're going to hit this net zero target. And indeed, these next 9 years, science is consistently telling us is a make or break decade for whether we will be able to find and then stay on that path to holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And I thought it was maybe useful to begin with a reflection on what net zero by 2050 really means. And as I said, that's what it means. It means getting to as close to zero emissions as possible. And then if there are remaining sources of emissions, finding ways to offset them. And so often, I think too, when we get into conversations about net zero, we get a bit trapped in the technology conversation of, oh, well, how do we offset things now? And from my perspective, that offsetting conversation, well, it's important to engage with early so we can start figuring it out. Much of that action comes later. What we focus on right now is using the existing technology that we have that we know will work to bend the curve on emissions and make sure that we are dramatically cutting emissions by at least 45% globally on average by 2030. And that means some countries are going to have to do more than 45%, and Canada might be one of those countries. So two important messages to begin with. The action starts right now and has to continue in earnest every year between now and 2050 for net zero to be a reality. And we are talking about using technologies and solutions that we already have at our disposal. And really what we need to be scaling up is not that technological innovation at this point, but more the political consensus and the level of political commitment to implement those existing technologies and solutions. So as was said in the introduction, I'm a member of the Net Zero Advisory Body. I wanted to quickly share, I'll take just 1 minute to do this, some findings from our initial report that we have offered to the Canadian government. And I think Yung will maybe unpack a little bit of what I share here in his comments later. And of course, look forward to hearing from Ralph and the amazing work that has happened with Ralph being involved over the course of the last couple of years, especially in thinking through what this transformation means for Canada, particularly from an economics perspective. So here we go. A number of months ago, the Net Zero Advisory Body released our initial observations, and we put forward 10 values and principles that we believe must be central to Canada's mission to get to net zero by 2050. Our foundational values are these 5. Number 1, seize the upsides. Number 2, put people first. 3, empower Canadians. 4, collaborate every step of the way. And 5, recognize and respect regional differences and circumstances. So you can see here that we are really, really trying to think about this as a whole of society project with humans at the center of it. This isn't about, scientific or technological speak, although of course those science and technology will be a huge part of the effort, but we really are understanding this as a project that we must undertake as communities, as people who are invested in building a climate safe future and a climate safe economy in Canada. And then the 5 design principles for that net zero future: act early and urgently. This of course picks up what I was saying earlier. We're not waiting to implement solutions, we're doing it right now. We're bending that emissions curve. Be bold and proactive. We know there's no more time for incrementalism. We need to be taking chances and implementing big, bold policies now that are transformative at a structural level. 3, acknowledge there's more certainty than uncertainty. Again, we have a lot of the technologies, the solutions, the knowledge that we need to get this project done. And a big part of the barrier at this point is about political will and implementation. don't get caught in the net. This is kind of what I was saying earlier about, right now we're focusing on driving those emissions down using the solutions we know we have. And we can, as we do that, think through what the further technological innovation that we need and policy innovation that we need. And finally, beware of dead ends. This is a long-term, decades-long project. We don't want to be investing in things today that maybe give us incremental emissions reductions that aren't going to be working to give us those emissions reductions or that societal change that we need in the future. And then here you have our initial lines of inquiry. No surprise that they line up with some of Canada's largest sources of emissions in buildings, transportation, and oil and gas sectors. And a fourth one that's maybe an interesting one around governance. So this is about how we actually make our governing institutions compatible with this big project. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it on to the next speakers. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I really appreciate your description of what's going on, but also your call for urgency, no dead ends, forward motion. That's what we have to have. And I think it's important to note that following on from the Paris COP 6 years ago, there was a real hiatus. People kind of felt, oh, we've cracked it. We're going to stop now and rest. There is no rest now. We need to buy time, not lose time at this point. So thank you for that. I'm now going to move to Yung. Are you ready? I know you're going to share some slides. Is that correct, Yung?
Yes, I'm ready to go, I think, Diana.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So really appreciate being here this evening. My name is Yung Wu. I have the pleasure of leading the Mars Discovery District, which is the largest urban innovation hub in North America, one of the largest in the world. We've got about well over 1,000, close to 1,400 high growth startups that are at all stages of growth. And they're all focused on the science and deep tech space. So what I wanted to do is just start off with a really quick video. Let's see if I can do this properly. Here we go.
What would it mean to go carbon neutral tomorrow? It would mean saving countless lives from air pollution, famine, and extreme weather events. It would mean building livable cities with efficient buildings and accessible means of transportation. And it would mean creating a thriving global economy, one led by Canada's clean tech ecosystem. By 2022, the international clean tech market will exceed $2.5 trillion. Canada's clean tech companies are already leading the charge, creating jobs faster than the rest of the economy. We have the solutions we need to tackle the climate crisis right now. Canadian companies are recycling carbon dioxide and trapping it in concrete. They're finding more efficient ways to fuel vehicles, heat buildings, and store energy. And they're pioneering new ways of getting around. What we need is a way to bring these innovations to scale. This is why Mars is embarking on a bold new mission to accelerate the adoption of clean tech solutions. By connecting clean tech ventures and corporations and working with governments and business leaders to help create sustainable markets, we can dramatically reduce carbon emissions. If the technology of just 10 companies were widely adopted by industry, it could cut gigatons of carbon. We know what it would mean to go carbon neutral tomorrow. Economic growth, prosperous communities, a healthy planet. So here's the real question: why wait until tomorrow?
I hope that came through. Otherwise, I probably don't deserve to be running a tech hub in Toronto. But here's what I wanted to say. This video was produced after we ran a challenge to find the top 10 pan-Canadian climate innovation champions. Most would probably call this a grand challenge or a moonshot program, but we're Mars. So of course, we would call this our mission from Mars for climate action. And the goal is to find the top 10 champions in energy, real estate, transportation that can materially reduce our greenhouse gas emissions while also growing our footprint in what's really being projected at a multi-trillion dollar, trillion with a T, climate innovation economy at the same time. Now, we've found the 10, and we've measured their potential impact on greenhouse gas emission reduction and the economic value creation. It turns out that a 1% market penetration for these 10 companies, which are real, they have real commercialized technology, they've raised real capital, they employ real people, they've driven millions and tens of millions of dollars of revenue already. The market penetration of these 10 companies at 1% takes out the equivalent of half of Canadian GHG emissions. A 5% penetration in the market takes out 3 times Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's really easy to say. And if I say it really quickly, it sounds easily. That's hard to do because adoption is one of the hardest things to do for these kinds of companies, and they take time. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it's this. Over a 29-year period between now and 2050, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to drive down emissions, no doubt about it, from our traditional sectors. But there is actually no pathway to net zero without some of these wild cards or game changers from the innovation class of solutions. I think it was interesting. I was reading in Economy Global that carbon dioxide emissions fell by 6.4% during this pandemic. And that was a lot less than I thought it would, because we literally had to shut down everything. And it cost us close to 4 million lives or more over this past pandemic. It's not a solution to just reduce emissions alone. We do have to focus on it. It's an imperative. It's a necessary but insufficient condition, though. And so I'm going to propose that we also have to, at the same time, invest into solutions that can scale, that can actually take out billions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions over time. Canada, I think, roughly emits about 730 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. That's carbon dioxide, methane, and the equivalents. It makes us the world's 10th largest emitter. But whether it's our energy supply, our real estate, our building stock, or our transportation systems, we do have Canadian companies with proven practical solutions. They just need our support to scale up and commercialize their technologies to realize their real impact. And I'm happy to go into some of the examples. There are some really, really interesting examples in sort of how do you capture waste heat and repurpose it? How do you actually take landfill and waste and turn that into renewable natural gas? How do you actually take carbon out of the air? Carbon engineering, for example. So I've just listed off 3 of the major companies in the energy category: Extract Energy, Carbon Engineering, and Storm Fisher. Real estate, we actually have artificial intelligence powered autonomous units that can run existing HVAC systems in commercial buildings. And it turns out that we can actually cut emissions on a retrofit basis, half of those emissions from these buildings, using what essentially is the same technology you use in an Uber to run an autonomous vehicle through artificial intelligence. So there's several of these really interesting solutions that are really worthwhile looking at right now, and we have to get going now. That's my overall summary. I think in order to do this, we have to coax capital off the sidelines. We need to crowd in public and private sector capital. We need to convince governments of every jurisdiction to make sure their procurement teams are seeking out and implementing these made in Canada clean tech solutions. And everything we do now that yields over the next 9 years and the next 29 years is going to not just chip away at the big impact we need, but also create, I think, the transition economy that Canada will have to require. That's it.
Thank you so much, Yung. That's fascinating. We've already had a question about going into some of the technologies. I think it's absolutely right to emphasize the opportunities in this space and the fact that we need to move forward and deploy the technologies. I think, obviously there are questions about the policy environment, whether that's conducive to doing what we need to do, and we can get into those later on. Maybe Ralph will be telling us a little bit about that. I'm not sure. Ralph, welcome. Nice to see you. Please come in now. Oh, you came and went.
There
There you are. Perfect.
Thanks, Diana. I wanted to start by putting up this picture of the atmosphere. I will get to some hard specifics in a couple of minutes. Can you see that okay? No?
No, I don't see anything yet.
Now?
Black screen.
Never mind. I wanted to start with a preface about the atmosphere itself. I find it easy in the day-to-day work that I do on this issue, sometimes to lose sight of the fundamental issue, which is the atmosphere, and in particular this very, very thin layer. It's only 10 kilometers thick, and we live in the bottom half of that. That's where all human life, all human history has taken place. It's incredibly thin. If you were to start going up and imagine the distances in terms of the road, say from here in Coburg to Port Hope, you would be suffocated and frozen to death by the time you got to the Burnham Market. That's how thin this life-supporting layer is. And it wasn't always life-supporting. It took a long, long time to get to that point where it could support a life form like humans. And one of the great ironies of the global warming issue is that the life-sustaining capability of the atmosphere itself was created by life. It was the eons of photosynthetic activity that took place long before humans evolved that gradually brought the atmosphere into this non-toxic state with its oxygen-rich atmosphere and its relatively mild and unvariable climate that actually made human civilization, the evolution of humans themselves, possible. And now here we are, this life form at the end of this long evolutionary story, behaving in a way which is imperiling the ability of that life-sustaining layer to sustain life. And it's imperiled beyond a shadow of a doubt. The stakes here are extremely high and extremely serious for human civilization, if not the species. And I wanted to just stop and restate that. That's why you see such passion and such energy and such consternation and such urgency in the discussions and the speeches and the graphs and the figures and the technology research, because we are up against it. This is an existential threat we are facing. And the question is, with all of this problem-solving capability that we've developed, with all of our ingenuity and our technological prowess, with our historical propensity to cooperate with each other and to take care of each other, are we smart enough? And do we love this place enough? And do we love each other enough to pull this off? That is, to build a human civilization that runs on renewable energy and circular flows of material, because those are the rules of the place. If you behave in any other way than that, sooner or later, you are going to get in trouble, because this is a global spherical ecosystem in which our economies and our societies reside, and those are the house rules. Having said that, I wanted to switch from the sublime to the grounded and just put up a chart that reflects some of the research that we've been doing at Corporate Nights with regard to what the emission reduction response might look like in Canada, what it might cost. Just going to put up one slide. Obviously, there's a mountain and a growing mountain of research on this topic. A lot of brains around the world are zeroing in on this. You just heard about the wonderful work at the Mars Center, and all over the world, and increasingly, I should say, in the corporate world as well. We see it at Corporate Nights every day. We've just finished putting together the list of the top sustainable corporations in the world that will be released at Davos in January. And every year we do this, it gets more and more competitive as the large corporate organizations in the world increasingly are turning their attention to this clearly enormous opportunity that will define not just the business of the 21st century, but the entire shape and future of the human prospect. Literally hangs in the balance of whether we can pull this off. In Canada, there are a few big things that have to happen. They all share in common that they are significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions, but they're very different systems. We have the buildings. The buildings are burning fossil fuels. They can't be doing that in a sustainable energy future. We know how to get them off fossil fuels. The technology is developed. It's not cheap, but so what? I mean, we do expensive things all the time. It's just a question of figuring out how to finance it, how to mobilize and train the necessary workforce to get the job done, and to scale it up at a level of mobilization, the likes of which I don't think we've seen, I was going to say since COVID, but really since World War II. That's the kind of mobilization that is now necessary in order to start behaving ourselves basically in terms of what the rules of surviving and sustaining a civilization on this planet are. So the buildings are the biggest one that you see on this chart. The bars on the left represent the costs in millions of dollars for achieving the emission reductions that are represented in the little clouds above each pair of bars. And the gray bar on the right represents the estimate of the person years of employment, the jobs, in other words, again, in millions that would be needed to pull this off. And what we find as we went through the big sources, whether it be the buildings, the commercial buildings, which is the second, so our homes, that's the first set. The commercial buildings, that's the second set of bars. Getting the remaining fossil fuels out of our electricity system, which is partly about additional renewable electricity generating capacity, partly about improving the east-west connections between certain provinces to allow the hydropower to flow into provinces that have high carbon in their grids, partly about developing and deploying the storage technologies that are necessary to support this. And then the fourth set of bars is about accelerating the uptake of electric vehicles. Here, the key factor, I think, is going to be getting the infrastructure in place for their charging and for the impact that they will have, the beneficial impact, I think, in the long run on the local electric distribution grids. The point is that in all of these areas and others, a great deal of solution analysis, including not just the technologies, but how it could be deployed, has already taken place. In some ways, we're fortunate that OPEC happened when it did, because we started thinking about how we might survive in an era beyond fossil fuels if we had to in the 1980s. I did my first long-range conservation and renewable energy scenario study in 1980. And so we've gained over decades now quite a bit of insight into what you would have to do if you ever got serious about getting the fossil fuels out of our buildings and our vehicles and our industrial systems. The challenge, as the previous speakers have all suggested up until now, is not really technological at this stage, although there are some difficult areas. The challenges overwhelmingly now are about mobilizing the capital, mobilizing the human institutions, and getting the motivation in place to get this done, because it's just not there yet. We say that we're in a climate emergency. We are without a doubt in a climate emergency, but we are not yet behaving as if we were in an emergency. We saw what an emergency response looks like over the last couple of years in response to COVID. And that is not what we see when we look at the way we are responding to climate change, not yet. So I think, just to wrap up, the good news is there are strategies and technologies and things that will get us through this if we do them quickly enough and on a large enough scale. But it's a wicked problem because it represents such a disruptive transformation. There will be stranded assets. There will be losers along the pathway. Overall, though, this is a good transition for Canada. It's a good transition for the world. And in some ways, it represents the ultimate test of the last several hundred years of human civilization development, which is, okay, we've shown we're smart and we can do big things. Can we now start actually putting in place an advanced civilization on this planet that runs on renewable energy and circular flows of material. That's the challenge, and it's actually quite exciting. And you can see from what's going on at Mars, you can see from what's going on in everywhere from the business schools to the engineering schools to the architectural schools. There's a tremendous amount of positive energy and momentum in the younger generation building behind getting this transition done. And now it's just a matter of picking up the pace and giving them the support they need to get the job done over the next 10 years.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Again, it's the urgency. It's what we have to do. We have to achieve system change, and that is a big task. But we have many of the building blocks. We've got lots of questions coming in. I just want to start by asking all of you, and I think everyone can come in now, what your opinions are on how we can change the dialogue and bring the country along with us in this. Maybe you call it a battle, but certainly a challenge. There's a question here about, saying, can we afford it? We're a cold country, we're spread out. Can we really afford it? My argument is that there is no business as usual. We can't not afford it. Like, not affording it doesn't work. That's pestilence, disease, and death. So we have to figure out ways to do this and to bring people along and to help them understand. Catherine, when you think about this net zero strategy and ensuring that there is public support and commitment, that the public are playing their part, but also enabling the politicians to play their part, how do you think about going, changing the dialogue?
So I take a different tack to this question. The dialogue has been changed and people are on board. Canadians want to see strong action on climate change. Not everyone understands the details, of course. The folks are preoccupied with their work and their families, and not everyone is here to have an in-depth conversation about what climate action looks like and how we develop climate policy. But the majority of Canadians understand that climate change is affecting them and their loved ones and the places that they cherish, and they want to see something done about it. We're already in that place. And in fact, where I take this conversation is a bit flipping the switch on how we understand responsibility for climate change and responsibility for taking action on climate change. Yung said something really important in his comments. For me, the biggest takeaway from the COVID-19 pandemic is the fact that we did all of the things that we've been told for over a decade, for many decades now, that we need to do to combat climate change, right? For decades, we've been told, if you want to do something about climate change, buy an electric vehicle, put solar panels on your roof, retrofit your house. All of these consumer choices that we have to make a difference in the world. We did all of that en masse. And Yung shared the overall emissions reductions that we saw over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's think about what we saw at the height of the global lockdown in April 2020. Global emissions fell about 17%. That's significant, but that means that we did everything. We shut the world down. And global emissions only fell 17%. So over 80% of global emissions rest in the hands of other people than us. Over 80% of global emissions are controlled by governments and the private sector. And so a big part of what we have to do as individuals is figure out how to hold governments and the private sector accountable for delivering transformation and emissions reductions in those big industrial sectors. So I think that's the conversation, that shift that needs to happen, is how we move from thinking on that very individual consumer-based responsibility that actually often turns us to despair and hopelessness because we can't do this alone as consumers. And how do we turn that on its head and start thinking at that structural scale and asking our governments and other major players to do their part?
Thank you. Do you agree with that, Yung? Is that your approach?
I actually very much do agree with that. And I think part of this is shifting gears from a zero-sum mindset into very much more of a let's create some multiplier effect here. And very much, I have always believed that this is a question of being bold and aspirational and then taking very deliberate and intentional actions to go after. We have 29 years, but in fact, we have 9 years to make all the decisions before it becomes irreversible by 29 years. So that's not a lot of time. It's within our lifetimes. It's certainly within the lifetimes of our children. You know, I think there's a fear, right, of sort of what's going to happen to my current standard of living, what's going to happen to my family, what's going to happen to my community. But, you know, this is a point in time where we can say, if we don't take action, we certainly do know what will happen to families, to communities, to businesses. And if we do take action, there's actually an opportunity for us to create a much a bigger impact for our families, our communities, and our businesses. I'll give you one example. You know, when we think about Alberta, it currently is in a position where in the legacy business of energy, it is one of the top producers in the legacy businesses of energy. But it's the same geophysicists, it's the same chemical engineers, and it's the same material scientists that you need to develop the future of energy. And so if we were to take a few bold steps there, there is definitely a pathway for us to create jobs, to create a future that's more sustainable, and to create a future for Alberta in what is otherwise going to be a legacy kind of a sector. So I think those are the kinds of moves we have to make. I've always believed you set a goal and then you basically make the moves in order to achieve the goal and adjust along the way as you find out.
Fantastic. We've got so many questions in the panel. It's so much to choose from, but there's a couple of questions around developing countries. And I don't know if anyone feels up to taking some questions around how Canada supports the transition in the rest of the world. This was an important issue at COP. The developing countries were asking for and expecting $100 billion a year. This has been a number that has been on the table for a long time. And the former Canadian minister was charged with delivering that money. Unfortunately, he and his German colleague didn't fully deliver that amount of money. It's sort of maybe going to get there in a few years' time. There was also issues of loss and damage, which is developing countries wanting to set up a fund to pay kind of reparations for the damages that they're already seeing. That also was slightly kicked down the road. They said they would set up a kind of mechanism to study the possibility. So, you know, there's lots of space in between action and where we are now on these things. There was a lot more talk about resilience, which is important, obviously, in some of these countries that have been hit hard. But how do we, as a country, as a rich country that does emit at very high levels, and I'm going to sort of, you could kind of raise your hand if you want to talk about this, because this wasn't really in our discussion. But do any of you have views on the role that Canada should play globally to enable this transition? Because it is global. I mean, we can do all we want in our own country, but it has to be global. Any takers for this one?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, it's important for people to support the transfers that we're talking about. For one thing, they're in our own interest. If it was true of COVID, that it doesn't do us any good to be vaccinated unless everyone is vaccinated, it's 10 times more true of global warming. There will be little point in succeeding locally unless we can succeed everywhere. That's the nature of the problem. That's the global nature of the problem. And so the financial support for the necessary investments that need to be made in developing economies is critical to succeeding in tackling this issue. And we need to get past the barriers that seem to be there to understanding why this is good, for us. So I think the self-interest argument is there. And you know, the way that the economy works globally now, it's really important that the commitments that were promised are delivered on, so that we can help these countries bypass, if you want to think of it that way, the fossil fuel period that our industrial development went through, which has caused all of this trouble. And we're seeing that, you know, for example, in Africa, with the way electricity is developing, to just take one example. So It's also can be a good news story, but definitely needs capital support from the northern rich countries, including Canada.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you for taking that one. On the issue of capital, a couple of questions in, and certainly Young talked about it. How do we unleash the resources domestically? We have these promising technologies, many of which are have not reached the cost that we expect them to reach in the long run. It's expensive to pull carbon out of the air now, but once it's deployed, that cost is expected to fall. But we have to get through that deployment phase. And at the moment, that's extremely tricky. So what do you see, Young, in Canada? Canada is known or is typically thought of as a country where it's quite hard to raise money. We don't have the venture capital environment. We don't have the funds that other countries have. Is that a real constraint in this country compared to other countries, do you find?
Well, you know what, I'll speak as an entrepreneur myself. Most would call me a compulsive entrepreneur that spent most of my time building companies based in Canada, but doing all of my business outside of Canada. And that's been the classic story, hasn't it been, for Canadian innovation, Canadian entrepreneurs, Canadian businesses. Look, I think there's actually something to the ecosystem that we're building, though. I don't think any one institution, any one government, any one company, startup, pension plan can do it by themselves anymore. And I think the power of the ecosystem that's now assembling and the power of aligned goals is gigantic. So this is the moment in time. And I actually believe that capital follows, capital does not lead. So what we have to do is find a way for adoption to go way up. And I'm talking about our own governments are the biggest procurement engines in Canada, and our own private sector have the largest adoption capability in Canada. To the extent that we can marry technologies that can change and transform these procurers and these adopters, that is then supported by capital. And of course, we are talking about blended finance here because, we're not just talking about venture capital or private equity. It doesn't quite fit those categories. These are things that require, that have passed technology risk, but need scale capital. So in a blended finance kind of a world, what do you back? Well, you back adoption opportunities between large private sector or public sector entities and some of these innovators that can actually change greenhouse gas emissions and drive, I think, quite frankly, great economic return back. I think there's this nexus of things happening right now, mostly driven by, let's call it what Ralph called it, enlightened self-interest among multiple parties that are really overlapping one another right now.
I would just throw into the
I had to do it
mix,
once. I had to do the mute thing once. Listen, there've been a couple of questions from audience members about the specifics of our governments that we have now, or the Ontario government, the Trudeau government. But I want to extrapolate a bit beyond that, but just talk about where Canada is in our journey. Obviously, we have this globally leading commitment to carbon pricing. We've adopted quite a sort of market-based approach more than regulation in this space, although we do have the clean fuel standards and things make a big difference. As I mentioned at the outset, there's been certain types of analysis, and perhaps Ralph can talk about this, that suggest that we won't get there with the policies that have been stated at the moment, or that we may just about get there, but it's a kind of stretch belief. What's your collective view on the role that governments can play at all levels to coming out of the COP to accelerate action in Canada? I mean, Kat and Ralph, you mentioned the types of things that have a really good yield, but at a general level, how should the governments be kind of coming out of this, taking the bull by the horns and saying, we take this seriously, we're going to up our game in this space? I'm going to go to Ralph first and then Catherine.
Yeah, well, I think the answer varies depending on the level of government in this country. And it's for the same reason that the answer varies according to however you phrase that question. What an individual can do, what a company can do, depends on their spheres of influence. I think at the local government level, and there'll be more about this in next week's panel, there are lots of opportunities where local government, because of its control and influence over land use and green space and housing and zoning policies and parks and parking, and there's a long list of ways in which local government policies and bylaws affect the level and the pattern of energy use in the community. And there's a growing body of knowledge within local governments, aided by the FCM's support of this kind of activity over the years, that is getting an understanding of what the leadership role can be for local government in tackling this issue. At the provincial and federal level, in both cases, we have a lot of misalignment between our regulatory agency mandates and the goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our electric utility regulatory agencies are not mandated in a way that makes it easy for them, or even possible for them, you might argue, to take an active or a proactive role in climate change mitigation. That needs to change. Even the Canadian Electrical Association is now saying we need to change the way that we regulate our utilities so that they can realize the potential contribution they can be making to this, because they're hamstrung right now by their mandate. At the federal level, there's a special role because of the sovereign wealth factor, in my view, and because of the peace, order, and good government component of our Constitution. With regard to the sovereign wealth, and this relates to something Yung said a moment ago, I don't think we get through this, not at the pace that we have to do it, without a significant presence of the public investor at the table, not just at the provincial level and so on, but bringing sovereign wealth to the picture so that we can get the long-term payoffs, of the long-term paybacks, and at the lower interest rates that money can bring to bear on the problem. And then beyond that, with respect to interprovincial trade in electricity, clearly there's a leadership role for the federal government there. And leadership in general is what we seem to be lacking. It's ironic, but the further up you go in the political hierarchy in this country, the thinner the atmosphere seems to get in terms of leadership. We're seeing a lot of really creative and vigorous activity at the local government level, and it tends to decline as you go up. The rhetoric gets stronger, but the actual action on the ground is not there yet. And that's holding us back. And I got a list of about 20 leadership roles that the federal government could be taking a much stronger position on than it is, that would move this forward. And again, it can and will happen when we really get to the point where this is being acted on as if it really were the emergency that we are saying that it is.
Catherine?
I mean, this is the kind of thing that we created governments to do. If governments aren't going to do it, who is? Right? Like, government is where we as a collective take action. And so we need our governments to be stepping up. And I think that we have unfortunately we're still coming off of a really long period of governments kind of being in a very hands-off role when it comes to shaping our society and our economy. But governments used to do that work quite a lot, right? Ralph mentioned earlier the effort on world wars. In World War II, the government of Canada created dozens of public institutions that did everything from building machines of war to putting people to work. And they did that with government money, with public funds, partnering with the private sector. And I think we need that scale of intervention at this point. And we have this kind of neoliberal hangover in our governments who think that they can't be going in and picking winners and losers. But the reality is that choosing not to make a choice is a choice in and of itself. And I think that what we can be doing as voters, as citizens, is talking to our elected officials and telling them that we expect a much more hands-on approach. and that we expect our governments to be coming up with large-scale, systems-level interventions. So it is true that we in Canada have never met a climate target, and that our climate policy has come a long way over the course of the last 6 years. And if we implement that policy ambitiously, hopefully those emissions start to come down. But here, what we've been saying on this panel is we need a large-scale economic transformation in this country. You know, all countries need it, but we really need that to happen here in Canada. And who's going to engineer that transformation but the Canadian federal government, working hand in hand with the provinces and territories and Indigenous communities? So that's what we're talking about. And really, from my perspective, I think we need to get back to a place where governments are much more comfortable taking charge of that kind of large-scale industrial planning, because it's where we are going to be needing to go, and it's that scale of effort that we need to be fueling.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. It's notable now that the private sector and the financial sector are, if anything, moving ahead of governments. They are held back by governments in some spaces because the incentives aren't correct. And because governments just have the kind of power that you've been talking about. This is a systems change issue. We need all hands on deck, but having governments being reticent and making commitments that they don't follow up with practical policies is one of the key problems. And as you mentioned at the start, we need to hold them to account. We need to actively empower them to do things, but they also need to get on with it. However, governments are, hard to move. But I think we've come to the end of our time. We've got endless questions, and I think all of us would love to carry on talking about this. But I'm going to hand back to Dorothy. I wanted to say thank you to those of you who've joined. Thanks for the questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to them all. Thanks to the panelists. I hope we've given you some context for what's going on and what needs to happen, but also for the opportunities. I think Yung spoke very powerfully to the technologies that Canada is developing and the opportunities for a better future if we can just move forward in the way that we need to.
Thank you, Diana.
Well, thank you, Diana, Catherine, Yung, and Ralph, for your thought-provoking information and discussion. You certainly clarified climate change and net zero concepts and greatly increased our understanding of our national and international obligations. And speaking of international, particular thanks to Diana and Catherine. It's already tomorrow for them, and they've held on very well and haven't blurred their words at all. So thank you so much. Thanks also to our Zoom audience for being with us this evening. Your loyalty and support keeps us motivated to bring you great programs. And stay tuned for our next week for our both live streamed and in-person event. This is looking at climate change at a very local level, looking at what's happening in Northumberland County. You'll be getting a reminder email soon. But before you leave, we ask you to take 30 seconds to answer a few questions that will pop up on your screen. We were surprised how many responses we got last week to our open-ended question, and that helps us design our programs to meet your needs and our ideas. Thank you so much, and good night.